All right, welcome to the New Mexico Military Museum. Today we are doing an interview with one of our lead volunteers here at the museum, Sal. He has been a wonderful contribution to the New Mexico Military Museum's library, getting that up and running, and continuing to work with our staff to develop and work with various programs throughout the museum. So it's great to have you on today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes. So just to go in and give our listeners a bit of a background about who you are, could you start with where you grew up and how you came to be involved at the museum?
I was born in Carlsbad, New Mexico, the son to a set of farmers down in the Pecos Valley. I graduated from high school in 1965. I had joined the Army National Guard a year before in 1964 when I turned 17 to assist the family with a little bit of additional income because I can assure you that farmers never get rich. So originally I had left for what would be my 6 month uh, training requirements that was required of every National Guardsman and reservist of that time. But it turned out that the Army released a weapons system and converted it over to the National Guard before the replacement systems were in place called the Chaparral Vulcan units. And when the build-up for Vietnam began in 1965, the Army found itself with a gap in that type of weapon system that was needed to support either protecting air bases or provide convoy escort to units moving from one location to the other. In the meantime, the Army had lost all its qualified personnel in what is called the M42 40 millimeter self-propelled system and the M55 quad 50 machine guns. Both those weapon systems exist in the display area here at the museum. So a message was put out asking for volunteers from National Guardsmen to come back on a tour of active duty and serve as instructors to stand up 4 battalions that were needed for Vietnam. So that would have included 4 battalions of the M42s, commonly called the Duster, and the supporting M55 Quad 50 machine gun units. I needed the GI Bill, and so I stepped up and volunteered for a tour out of Fort Bliss. In the meantime, come 1965, from March on, the decision was made to commit ground forces to defend South Vietnam. And consequently, that would put me on a very special bond between the soldiers we were training, knowing where they were headed, that the better we trained them, the better odds were in their favor they could survive their year tour of duty. And that would also put me in the situation of serving in funerals firing squads. During my time at Fort Bliss, I participated exclusively in firing squads. A couple of times that I can recall, I did serve as an interpreter. Having said that, to get a better understanding of how casualty assistance was structured at that time, Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, was responsible for New Mexico and West Texas. Obviously, back then, as today, a lot of communities in West Texas and New Mexico are still very rural type communities. So on a couple of occasions, while my duties were firing squads at the Fort Bliss National Cemetery, on 2 occasions that I can recall, by nature of limited English parents, I was asked to also step in as an interpreter. And so I had to do a lot of rehearsing to translate the presentation of the American flag to a set of parents without losing the message that was intended to convey. But all in all, my contact with the family was almost non-existent since it was a graveside service. In 1968, when I returned back to the state, I discovered that the state itself had assigned an active duty advisors, usually a major and a master sergeant, at each battalion level headquarters, and they would serve as the initial notification to a family that their soldier had been killed in action in Vietnam. So that's what would take me, again, because of my bilingual capabilities, to some rural communities in West Texas and mainly southern New Mexico to serve as an interpreter between the message, the official message from Department of the Army to the grieving family. The other thing is that the notification teams were encouraged to never travel solo, which stands to reason. Being in rural areas could be dangerous, especially if you're not familiar with the area. For example, a few times we stopped at a sheriff or a state police office to ask for directions or ask that they escort us to the respective area because rural route to community X, Y, and Z just still didn't tell us how to get there. This was long before GPS. This was before cell phones. This was just the old-fashioned navigation of trial and error. Once a family saw a deputy sheriff or a state police officer escorting a military sedan to their location, it didn't take a genius to figure out why we were approaching. And so while it was very solemn, we had assistance from state police and deputy sheriffs, and then sometimes the local community police department. So that worked out well. Since the Army was on the build-up side, there was many times that the advisor notifying the family did not have a partner. The two man contact team didn't always fall out, and so consequently I would routinely be asked to travel with them, if for nothing else for safety, not necessarily for interpretation.
Sure.
And so me being of the age that most of the casualties we were notifying families on, the tendency was to ask questions. Did you happen to know my son? Did you serve with him? And so again, in the civilian world, they didn't understand that we were a notification team, not necessarily someone who knew their soldier.
Sure.
But on that note, the policies from the commanding general at Fort Bliss at that time dictated that as much as possible, the honor guard or the firing squad would consist of soldiers from that respective state. It wasn't always possible because, again, we were at war. Troops were deploying in the thousands every week. But as much as possible, New Mexicans went and served New Mexico families, and West Texas residents went and served West Texas families. So it worked out fairly well, not 100% because of the wartime demands, but the families were very appreciative of that. So in addition to the initial notification, whether it was just to be partnership with the Army advisor that was doing the actual notification, I've already discussed my interpreter roles, and they would be briefed that the survivor's assistance officer would follow in and would give them a date. We were just the initial contact team. We were not the survivor's assistant team that would provide them with the benefits and everything, funeral arrangements. That was up to the survivor's assistant officer, and he followed within a day or two to coincide with the arrival of the remains. Again, in wartime, that's not always a perfect plan, but we will work it as best we could. And so on some occasions, I assisted the survivor's assistance officer in escorting the family to a community that did have public transportation, i.e. a train or an airport, to receive the remains of their fallen soldier. At most of the time, it was the fallen son, but on occasion there was a fallen father, a fallen brother, because there was no surviving parents. And so we had to be flexible, but the guidance was very clear. Always be compassionate of what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and why you're doing it. And so that put me in on the survivor's assistance. Again, sometimes in assisting a family, not necessarily as an interpreter, but just assisting them, what this benefit means or what that benefit means. And usually at that time, the personal belongings from Vietnam had not reached yet. So there could be a subsequent trip later to deliver the personal belongings to the deceased soldier. But by then, the funeral had already occurred. That was already done. Some families would pick a very private ceremony, and by private, I mean just the immediate family. They would decline an honor guard. They would decline a firing squad. Some may request no firing squad, but someone to fold the flag and present it to, again, usually the parents, but that wasn't necessarily the rule. And again, the guidance was clear. If you have to adjust based on conditions on the ground, do so. You work for that family, you would be compassionate towards that family, and if they requested something and it was permissible by regulation or law, we would accommodate them. Some families asked the firing squad and the honor guard, or both, to join them for the traditional reception meal following the funeral. We would accommodate them. When that was done, again, the survivor assistant officer took over. We'd be put back on the bus and head back home.
Yeah, to serve the families with in everything you did.
Right. We did our portion of what was obligated to the family. The survivor's assistant officer there was no set time as to how long he could stay, because there could be delays here or delays there that didn't make it possible for him to leave in 2 or 3 days. So I don't want to categorically say that in 1 or 2 days he was out of there, because that wasn't the case.
It wasn't strictly the
rule. And when you read the benefits and walk through the benefits to the family, the service group life insurance that at that time had just been increased to $20,000, as they absorbed all that, they may have questions and would have questions. Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I move my son to a national cemetery at a later date? Those kind of questions. So initially they're absorbing things, but it hasn't soaked in yet. And then from 68 to 70, I was involved again with the notification, survivor's assistance, and at times to not command, but oversee the honor guard and the firing squad, that the survivor assistant officer was focusing on the family. I latched on to him and tell the honor guard where to be, when to be there, and the firing squad make sure they knew where the cemetery was, make sure that we knew where the gravesite was, because at that time all the services were at the actual gravesite. And so it was a very busy 2-3 days in coordinating all that. The difference between an honor guard and a firing squad is the honor guard, when a family would request an honor guard or full military honors, the honor guard would serve as the pallbearers. And the firing squad still remained waiting at the cemetery, because it wasn't protocol-wise, and it would be very tacky to tell the firing squad, okay, you take the coffin to the gravesite and then drop what you're doing and go over here and grab a rifle and serve as a firing squad, because the two are pretty well simultaneous type, knitted together to serve next to each other. A firing squad would meet exclusively at the cemetery. The honor guard would be with the remains until after the funeral, including the church service and the trip to the cemetery.
Perfect. Yeah, going on from there, as we're going or nearing the end of the Vietnam War and things like that, did you end up staying in the military service?
Yes, I did. As time went on, I myself went back on active duty through the Army National Guard program, and I continued to serve the local population in survivors assistance, casualty reporting, funerals and honors, but not tied into the Vietnam War. Some of the veterans we buried were Vietnam veterans, but they were not on active duty, killed in action type. And so my link with veterans in general has been since 1964, even through today.
Absolutely. And, going on from that, you've done a lot of work for us here at the museum over the years. As I understand you were involved very early on in the setup of the museum.
Yes, the museum itself moved over to this location in 1992, and they had moved from different locations within the National Guard complex, and finally it was decided to move them here on a permanent basis. And with every move, things are lost, and we're finding that out with the library and trying to stand it up. And years ago, retired Brigadier General Jack Fox made a trip to Fort Bliss to see if we could retrieve all the museum items that we had donated to Fort Bliss when the museum was non-existent, non-operational, I should say. And by then they had moved that, all the artillery type museum items, including uniforms, to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. As the Army reorganized after the Cold War, Fort Sill, Oklahoma assumed a lot of what was once at Fort Bliss. He made contact with Fort Sill, Oklahoma. They had no record of anything that had come in from Fort Bliss, and they were nonchalant that if it's lost, it's lost. We're not going to spend research time trying to track down what may have belonged back to New Mexico. So I don't want to say a lot of things were a total restart from scratch, because there were some items left behind here and they're authentic from right after World War II. But it was a rebuild mode over the last going on 30 plus years now since they've been located here. Knowing that, before I arrived here to work here, I would assist as much as I could, either through donations, some volunteer time here and there. And then there was an opportunity when I left state government that I created my own handyman license, that the military affairs, the adjutant general of that time, offered me a 20-hour contract job on the maintenance side. And then he could afford 30 hours, but he wanted me to start spending time in the museum operations. And then the full-time employees were reassigned elsewhere, and funding did not allow for backfills. So I was offered a 40-hour as a contract employee to maintain the museum and keep it going. I worked at the museum as the curator slash director for 3 years, 1 year as a contract employee and 2 years as a state employee. And then in 2014, I had an opportunity to take a promotional job at Department of Veteran Services, and that's where I spent my last 5.5 years of state government.
Perfect. Yeah, no, you've definitely contributed a lot to where we're at right now as a museum. So tell us more about your vision and idea for the library. What prompted you to take on that project?
When I made contact with Larita, that I asked her, where can you utilize me best? And she said, well, helping set up the library. I didn't realize at that time they were still in boxes, busted up. Some had gotten wet, some had gotten damaged. I said, well, I'll do that. And I told her I'm familiar with the due decimal system, and so we can live with that. I can be of some help. And it's been slow, but it's been precise. We have not had to rebuild or reinvent the wheel because we oopsed something and had to start back from scratch. So when we're done with the library, it's going to be a first-class operation.
Absolutely, and it's already starting to get well on track towards that ultimate goal. And so, looking back on your experience serving in the National Guard, especially during your time in Vietnam, was there any major lessons or anything like that that you would like people to take away from your experience?
Uh, yes, one thing that has stayed in my mind since the 66 through 70 episode is, one, how short life can be, and two, and this is a big two, there but for the grace of God go I. Most of the soldiers that I was involved with, of the casualties, were either 1 year younger or 1 year older or my age. And so that gave me a cultural awakening and a rude awakening of saying, enjoy life while you can. And that has stayed with me ever since then. Now they'd be in their mid-late 70s like I am, but they never had a life.
They gave everything to maintain the freedoms that we so cherish in this country.
Absolutely.
Yes. And to conclude with that, thank you so much for coming down here. We really appreciate you sharing your story with us. Was there anything else you wish to talk about while we have you?
Yes. When I was transitioning to take over the curator position, uh, my predecessor came by and saw me briefing a tourist group in the compound to the west of us here on weapon systems. And he said, Sal, you did pretty good. In fact, you did awfully good. I said, well, you got to understand that weapon systems that are now in the museum were the weapons I served in back in the 1960s.
So very familiar.
So I'm very, very familiar with them. And the other thing, the Huey helicopter, that if anything symbolizes the Vietnam War, It's a Huey helicopter. There were some families, several families. I don't know how many, but it was not one or two. It was several families who would come with their dad, and the dad would go over to the Huey and would get very emotional. And I'd give him time alone with the Huey. Then I'd walk over to him and ask him, "Where were you wounded?" And he'd look up to me, "How do you know?" I said, "Because the last conscious moments you had before you passed out was the distinct noise that the blades of a Huey makes when it's taken off and you were a body inside that helicopter."
Wow.
He said, "Thank you, but that is very emotional to this day." And the Huey did make a very distinct sound. And in my last conscious moments, I would remember that distinct sound that saved my life.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that's a powerful story, and thank you so much for sharing that. Was there any other moments like this that you can recall?
Not like those per se, but my last agency at Veteran Services, working with veterans, exclusively with veterans, I realized I found my calling. I'd always worked with veterans, whether I was at the museum, whether I was at CYFD, whether I was at Department of Transportation, and I found my calling. I was at home with them. I understood their situation. As President Clinton would say, I share their pain. And so that was very fulfilling. All my assignments were very fulfilling, but at the Veteran Services, I found my calling.
Just serving those.
And that caused me to speed up and accelerate the time I donated the museum, because this is unique in that the beautiful thing is I found bitter people don't come to a military museum to pay tribute to someone or something or a cause. They come to be solemn. They come to be respectful to the generation before them, two generations before, and to ask questions. Do you have anything on so and so? And so this is the link between the past and our future.
Absolutely, and that is a big chunk of the work we're doing here at the New Mexico Military Museum podcast, is just being able to sit people down and preserve those stories that otherwise would have been lost to time. And so we really appreciate you sharing that with us.
And thank you for this interview.
Yes. All right, and just any concluding thoughts or anything like that?
I heard a very recent report just within the last day or two that even in the post-pandemic area, people feel very isolated, very alone, very lonely, very uh, nobody cares. And my challenge to you is, if you are looking for something to do, the museum would welcome volunteer time.
Absolutely. We're always looking for more people who are passionate about serving and bringing recognition to those who have given the ultimate sacrifice to our country, and those who continue to walk with the honor and recognition that we give here at the museum to our soldiers.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And again, thank you for your service to our country. It means a lot to us on the civilian side. We really appreciate it.